Hello, Euro nerds, and welcome to this fourth installment of post-AP exam global notes. This section here is going to cover the Middle East from about 1750 to the present. So let's get started. All right, first, quick review of geography in the Middle East. First, at least know the context of geography, the most important part being the river valley civilizations on the Nile River, of course, being ancient Egypt, Tigris and Euphrates, Mesopotamia, and knowing how civilizations have largely been constructed around river valleys. They probably won't explicitly ask that on your Regents exam, but that is still good context to know. Beyond that, do know, especially one in particular man-made waterway in the Middle East, the Suez Canal, which connects the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, and therefore all the way to the Indian Ocean. That is a super important waterway for trade, and you might most recently remember it because it was blocked by that big ship like a couple years ago. I recorded this in 2022, and it was the result of many memes. All right, next. Geographically speaking, the importance of oil. Think about the second industrial revolution, which is going to start seeing the increase in cars powered by the internal combustion engine. And what makes an internal combustion engine run? Well, you need petrol, you need gasoline, you need diesel. So oil has a massive concentration in the Middle East. Most oil-rich country being Saudi Arabia, other ones, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and then a bunch of these countries eventually create a oil conglomerate called OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And basically, that's also not just the Middle East. It includes like Venezuela, it includes Nigeria and Africa. But basically what they do is they control the amount of oil that's produced every day, and that actually creates what the oil prices are. So if they decrease production, that's going to increase the price of oil, therefore the price of gasoline. Additionally, another thing to note in the Middle East is the scarcity of drinking water, fresh drinking water in some areas. For example, in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, water rights is actually one of the centralized themes there, obviously besides the land controversy, but like just the ability to have fresh drinking water. That simple human right is often results in conflict. All right, next, we've actually already covered Ataturk in our AP Euro notes, but we'll just quickly review. Oops, sorry. First, just know the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, which resulted from World War I. Turkey becomes an independent state, and the first president of Turkey is Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And basically, the words to associate with Ataturk: westernization, modernization of Turkey, similar to what we know for like Peter the Great in AP Euro. So he's going to establish a sort of form of democracy, although one can easily argue Ataturk's government was fairly authoritarian, and he's going to change a bunch of cultural parts of Turkey. So he's going to abolish the Muslim calendar, incorporate the international calendar. He's going to adopt the metric system. He's going to he's going to adopt the Latin alphabet with the Turkish language. So he's going to basically get rid of the Arabic alphabet, and this movement was quite controversial at the time because he's basically going from 0 to 60 in like half a second when it comes to cultural change. So Ataturk, again, westernization, modernization, and you're probably all set for Ataturk. All right, so the next set of notes is going to get into the origins of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So first, we got to talk about the ethnic group known as Arabs. So in AP Euro, we spent a lot of time talking about the huge ethnic group called Slavs, and then how there are different persuasions of Slavs: Ukrainians, Russians, Serbians, you get it. Arabs, similar idea. Massive ethnic group, and then it gets a little bit more specific from there. For example, Moroccan Arabs, Egyptian Arabs, Palestinian Arabs in the region of Palestine, Saudi Arabian Arabs. So you kind of get the idea. Huge ethnic group, but more specific versions of it within. Okay, so to talk the general context of the Arab-Israeli conflict, we're going to go back quite a bit of time first, but largely the conflict itself is a fairly 20th century conflict, but of course the religious issues are thousands of years before that, but largely the conflict itself is based in the starting in the 20th century. So let's go back 5,000 years. So first, this region known as Palestine was first settled by the descendants of Abraham. So ancient Hebrews settled in Palestine approximately the year 3000 BCE. They established many different civilizations surrounding Jerusalem, many different city-states effectively. And then we fast forward to the Roman Empire. Romans come in and they take over Palestine. The Jews revolt against them, but Rome crushes it violently, and this drives Palestinian Jews from Palestine, generally, for the most part, north, all the way to Eastern Europe. So that's labeled as the first Jewish diaspora. So again, to review, about 3,000 years ago, ancient Hebrews settled in Palestine, then they were driven out by the Romans starting around 70 CE. After the Romans drove the Jews out, and once the Roman Empire collapses, then Arabs settled in Palestine. So after Islam is founded in 600 AD, we're going to have then the progression of Arab empires or caliphates throughout North Africa as well. But largely, Arabs have been in Palestine from approximately 700 CE to the 1900s, and of course still obviously today. So effectively, Palestinians are, again, a persuasion of Arab, and they've largely been there for now. I'm trying to do rough math in my head right now with 700 and 2,000, 1,300 years. There we go. So why does Palestine, specifically in this case, Jerusalem, matter? First, Jerusalem is an incredibly important city to the three largest monotheistic religions in the world: Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So specifically for Muslims, Jerusalem is really important because it has the Dome of the Rock, which is where, according to the Islamic tradition, Muhammad ascended to heaven. So it is like the second most holy place on earth for Muslims. Additionally, the Arab-Palestinian civilization was part of the Muslim Golden Age that we saw in the 1300s. So this area is rife with religious culture, importance, history. All right, again, I'll skip over the videos just to shorten these as much as possible. All right, this section, total review from AP Euro. So now we fast forward to the late 19th century. We see the significant rise of Zionism, which is Jewish nationalism. And it's the idea that Jews should have a state outside of Europe because of growing, or at least continued and growing, anti-Semitism. We know that stuff from AP Euro, Dreyfus Affair, late 19th century, we get it. So after the beginning of the Zionist movement, there's just gradual emigration of Jews to Palestine. Not that much. Most of that's going to occur after 1917, and especially after 1945. But this is really the beginning of more settlement of Jews to Palestine. Okay, so a few key moments in the progression of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So again, most of the conflict is largely based on the 20th century, more so than the thousands of years of religious history that I just mentioned. It is a conflict based on land. That's the root of it. So a significant turning point was during World War I, 1917, the Balfour Declaration. So the British Foreign Secretary, James Balfour, sent out a really short message stating the British government supports the idea for a quote-unquote national home for Jewish people in Palestine. The second paragraph is often left out. The second paragraph said, as long as there was no prejudice displayed against the existing population. That existing population were Palestinians, Arabs. So basically, now that Britain has given support for Jews establishing a state in Palestine, this is going to now increase more emigration of Jews to Palestine. Again, not nearly as much as much as what 1945 will bring. But when we're seeing now an increase in emigration of Jews to Palestine, that is now going to increase ethnic tension between Jews and Arabs. Then we have the Holocaust, and this really adds more sympathy in the Western world for Zionism, and it really is going to lead to the actual creation of Israel in 1948. Okay, so in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, so the survivors of the Holocaust largely fled to the United States, one, but more importantly to Palestine, to the British-controlled mandate. We remember the mandates from the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, which basically is essentially a British colony in the region of Palestine. So now we have Jews fleeing to the British Mandate of Palestine, and that's going to increase ethnic tension between Arabs and Jews. And now when we have that tension increasing and increasing, there's now a call for the United Nations to step in and to potentially reduce the amount of tension between Arabs and Jews. So here is what the United Nations came up with as a plan. Their idea was to partition the British Mandate of Palestine. So basically create two states. One, an Arab state that you see in red here. In blue, a Jewish state. And then around Jerusalem, they would actually make that kind of like an international city where neither side would actually have territorial claim to it because its importance for three monotheistic religions. So Jews accepted this plan, but Arabs did not. They rejected it. They largely viewed it as another form of Western imperialism. They also did not think that Jews would keep to their state, and they would actually consider taking over the rest of the area. So once that plan was thrown out the window, Israel is going to proclaim itself as an independent state in 1948, David Ben-Gurion being its prime minister. This proclamation of Israel being an independent state, Jewish state, is going to now escalate into the first Arab-Israeli war because the surrounding Arab states, like Lebanon, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, did not recognize Israel as a legitimate successor to the British Mandate of Palestine. So now we'll get into a bunch of conflicts starting from 1948, progressing into really the 1990s and early 2000s as well. So the first Arab-Israeli war actually has different names depending on which side we're talking about. This is largely like the international perspective, first Arab-Israeli war. Arabs call this the quote-unquote catastrophe in Arabic. So here's what happens. Basically, Israel becomes a country, and the surrounding Arab countries invaded Israel. So Jordan takes over the west bank of the Jordan River. So I'm actually going to skip over a slide so I can show you what that means. So when I've taught this for now 7 years, students often have a difficult time figuring out what West Bank is. They often think it should be like on the wrong side, but it's the west bank of the Jordan River. So the Jordan River is here on the eastern side. The West Bank is quite literally on the west bank of the Jordan River. Then there is a region called Gaza, the Gaza Strip that you see just west of the West Bank. Those are going to be occupied by Arab states. Oops, sorry. Let me go back. All right, so Jordan takes the west bank of the Jordan River. Egypt takes control of the Gaza Strip. So again, Arab control now over the West Bank and over the Gaza Strip. Israel counterattacks. They also have a bunch of weapons and money from the Western world, especially the United States. And what they're going to do is they basically win the war, and now they have gained a bunch of land. As they're also expanding, they're creating a significant refugee crisis. So as Israel is getting larger, they're forcing Palestinians from cities into refugee camps. They would basically go to a Palestinian village, often destroy the village, and then force them into a refugee camp. And some of those refugee camps today are pretty large cities in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip. So now Israel has, at the end of the first Arab crisis, is more land, and additionally they control West Jerusalem, which is a very important holy part of the city of Jerusalem. All right. What else we have? Okay, fast forward, 1967, the Six-Day War. So Egypt closed off Israel's access to the Gulf of Aqaba. And the Gulf of Aqaba at this point was pretty much Israel's only way of getting to the Red Sea and therefore the Indian Ocean. So Israel attacks Egypt, and they also went to war against Syria and Jordan as well. In 6 days, Israel beat all of them. 6 days. So here's what Israel now controls after the Six-Day War. This is a significant turning point in the favor of the state of Israel. So 1, Israel officially occupies all of the West Bank. So they took the West Bank from Jordan, and they also controlled East Jerusalem. So now Israel has complete control of Jerusalem and the West Bank. Then if you look to the northeast, you see the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights has more historically been Syrian. Israel takes over that. Gaza Strip that you see in the west there, Gaza Strip, taken from Egypt, now becomes Israeli. The Israelis also take the Sinai Peninsula, which has historically been Egypt, although eventually Israel will give that back to Egypt, but we'll get to that in a bit. So here's the overall results. Israel is now 4 times larger than its original size. They're also now going to increase restrictions on the existing Palestinians in these areas. So, for example, they're going to start setting up refugee camps that effectively force Palestinians to only live in these refugee camps. So they're restricting their movement, their rights to movement. They are also going to significantly decrease their autonomy. We're going to see that change a little bit later on, but basically restrictions are now increasing on the existing Palestinian people. So essentially, Israel is now occupying former Palestinian land. Other results. This is going to dramatically increase Palestinian nationalism because effectively most of their land that they were used to having is now under Israeli control or Israeli occupation. All right, so Six-Day War, particularly important for the Regents exam. Yom Kippur War, not so much. Basically, just know it as like further conflict between Israel and the surrounding Arab states. But the Yom Kippur War was a surprise attack on the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur. And basically, initially, Israel loses some ground because it was their holy day and their military was not necessarily expecting it. And additionally, the Arab states create the first oil embargo. And this oil embargo has a massive impact on especially the Western world. This is like the first oil crisis in the United States, which leads to a huge increase in the gasoline prices. That's going to actually happen again in 1979 after the Iranian Revolution. And then the United States actually steps in. So as we know, post-World War II, the United States has a growing influence in world affairs. Sometimes people will call the United States the quote-unquote world policeman. And this is sort of an example of that. Actually, the United States generally will step in quite a bit with the Arab-Israeli conflict in multiple parts. So the U.S. got basically mediated a deal. Israel agrees to withdraw from specifically the West Bank of the Suez Canal. Not the West Bank that we talked about, but a part of the Suez Canal, but overall continued their control over the Sinai Peninsula. So it was largely a war that doesn't have a ton of importance compared to the Six-Day War or later on, but we do see this as growing tension between Arabs and Israelis. Okay, a nationalist organization to know. So the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, is founded with a very simple goal. Liberate Palestine from Israeli control. So they create a Palestine simply independent of Israel. How much they're talking about, debated. But simply create a state, an Arab state called Palestine, separate from Israeli control. So first, the organization claimed to represent all Palestinians, but what we're going to find is that there's a spectrum of nationalism with Palestinians. Some are more moderate, some are more radical. Generally, the PLO isn't going to be as radical as some of the other organizations that we will see emerge from this conflict. So the PLO is going to go through multiple phases of how they're going to resist Israeli occupation. Some cases it's very moderate with political campaigning, discussions, what have you, but they will also engage in guerrilla warfare and terrorism, which they will actually later renounce, and then other organizations will actually start taking part of the terrorism later on. So then, 1974, 10 years after the organization, the United Nations officially recognizes the PLO as an observer in the UN, but not a voting power. So in the UN, most of the 100 and whatever it is, 93, 95, 97 member states, they have voting privileges. The PLO has observer status, so they can engage in debates, they can give speeches, but they can't vote on resolutions. So that, again, the reason they did that is because the PLO doesn't actually have a state at this point. Okay, new turning point, sort of. It's called the Camp David Accords. So Camp David is the presidential retreat in Maryland. Often presidents go there to kind of get out of the view of Washington, D.C. It's also where occasionally presidents will invite heads of state if they want to get them out of the eye of the press to a certain extent. Although that's all relative because we are talking about the president. There's always press around him. So regardless, the U.S. president at the time, Jimmy Carter, yes, your favorite peanut farmer from Georgia, mediates a deal between the Egyptian president and the Israeli prime minister. And basically, this accord effectively, this is the most important takeaway here, first major peace agreement between an Arab state, in this case Egypt, and Israel. So we now see reduction in tension. And then, most importantly, this accord will eventually lead to Palestinian autonomy or self-rule, especially in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank, although we're going to see the impact of Jewish settlements, Israeli settlements in the West Bank. But this is kind of a decreasing in the tension. When we talk about the Cold War, we talk about the ebbs and flows in the amount of tension. This is sort of similar. This is a decrease in tension in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And then we're going to see the tension increase. So, major idea to know is this second dash here. So, the Israeli government is going to begin the construction of settlements, permanent settlements in occupied territories, specifically in the West Bank. So basically imagine a planned community that you're familiar with in any neighborhood you're from. And imagine that planned community has a massive gate, barbed wire fence, and soldiers that surround it and protect it. So basically what Israel is doing is they're actually giving tax breaks to Israelis to now live in these Israeli settlements inside of Palestinian territories, specifically the West Bank. So basically what they're doing is they're gradually reducing the amount of land that Palestinians can actually live on. So these settlements still exist today. They are still dramatically increasing in number. I'll show you a map in a few slides to show you the progression of the Israeli settlements. So, in protest of that, there's going to be the first intifada. Intifada in Arabic literally means uprising. So basically the intifadas, there's at least 3 of them, is when usually younger Palestinians are protesting the occupation of Palestinian lands by Israel. And they also are usually protesting the horrific conditions in those overcrowded refugee camps that Israel has forced them to stay in since the Arab-Israeli War of 1948. And they will start attacking, usually, Israeli military. So in this case, usually really the symbol of the first Intifada in particular, and then the other Intifadas as well, is they would throw rocks at the Israeli soldiers, because largely Palestinians didn't have as much access to weapons as Israelis would. So they would throw whatever they had, in this case, rocks at Israeli soldiers. In some cases, they'll have more planned boycotts. In other cases, they will engage in terrorism, especially suicide bombings of Israeli buses. So basically, after there's an uprising of Palestinians against Israeli occupation, the Israeli government moves in with overwhelming military force, tanks, airplanes, bombs, missiles, you name it, and they just crush the revolt with pretty devastating effects. So as you can see from the results here, is at least 2,000 Palestinians are killed, at least 200 Israelis are killed, and this, again, is going to add to more and more tension, and these intifadas are very public as well. That's also often brings a lot of sympathy towards Palestinians in the Western world, is seeing the Israeli response with overwhelming force to these uprisings. Okay, then we're now going to see a reduction in tensions. In particular, when the PLO officially renounced the use of terrorism in 1988, Yasser Arafat being the leader at that point, and then the Oslo Accords, which are pretty important. So looking at the Oslo Accords, 1993, essentially what it stated was Israel is given like recognition. So like the PLO recognizes Israel as a state that's going to stay there. In exchange, Palestinians are given like limited autonomy or self-rule in the Gaza Strip and in certain towns in the West Bank. So again, Israel is not giving up control of the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. They're just giving some autonomy to Palestinians. So like in the Gaza Strip, they have their own, Palestinians have their own police force, they have their own water system, although technically Israel controls both the water system and the electrical grid there. But again, it is a form of a mediation. Okay, then we fast forward to the turn of the century and millennia. So the second intifada is going to occur over a pretty long period of time, early 2000s. So essentially, both sides, Israel and Palestinians, are accusing the other one of not, honoring the Oslo Accords. So Israelis believe that the PLO did not acknowledge Israel as a state, and then Palestinians believe that Israel is simply just occupying more and more of their land. So, additionally, Israeli settlements are now increasing in number in the West Bank, and Palestinians view these simply as Israeli imperialism and a violation of significant of international agreements. So then, to protect those settlements, the West Bank in general, Israel actually constructed a massive wall around the West Bank, and they also set up checkpoints between Israel and the Palestinian areas. So if you are an Israeli citizen, you can just drive right through the checkpoint. Think of it as like one of those toll booths that you see on the thruway. No problem whatsoever if you're an Israeli citizen. But if you are a Palestinian, you have to have a really specific passport to go from a Palestinian area to Israel. And if you don't, they don't allow you. So there are some Palestinians who have never seen the Dome of the Rock because they're simply not allowed to go into Jerusalem because they don't have the correct passport to do so. So the second intifada was marked with more suicide bombings on public buses, and this has an even larger death toll than the first intifada, with at least 3,000 Palestinians killed and at least 1,000 Israelis killed. So I want to show you this super important photograph of from the early 20th century, and it really became the symbol of the resistance of Palestinians against the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land here. So again, that stone really is the symbol of Palestinian resistance. All right, so this is a map of the growing Israeli settlements in the West Bank especially, and also the Gaza Strip, as you can see, as well. So in the, in the more dark brown areas, that's full Palestinian, control of those areas, at least for now. And then anything that you see in, the gray, not gray, I don't know what color that is. Maybe gray. Taupe, I don't know. That is Israeli control, so significant Israeli presence. And basically, wherever you see a blue dot, that's an Israeli settlement, those are going to be very well protected by the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, their military. And basically what Israel's been doing since the beginning of this conflict is increasing the number of these Israeli settlements, effectively reducing the amount of land Palestinians can actually live on. All right, so that is Palestinian-Israeli conflict in just under a half an hour. So if you have more questions, feel free to ask me in class, but we got to move on to other sections here. So the Iranian Revolution, super important, often gets a question or so, maybe two, on the Regents exam every year, so got to know it. 1979, I just like to memorize that year. It's pretty just darn important for world history. So Iran at this point has had two major, well, actually three leaders. And the third one we just got to know here. So his name is Shah Reza Pahlavi. Shah is their term for king, and Reza Pahlavi being, of course, the king in this case. Although, confusingly, his father was named exactly the same thing, and they didn't even use the word junior, but still. This is the guy who's going to get overthrown. That's what we got to know. So this guy that you see was largely pretty pro-Western. He attempted to further secularize and Westernize Iran more so than his father did. And for example, he's reducing restrictions on women and overall pretty pro-United States. And the United States has significant interest in Iran, especially because of its oil. So the issue with this westernization process is it largely alienated the religious establishment of Iran. And as you remember from Global One, Iran is largely Shia Muslim, and there's now growing Islamic fundamentalism in Iran, and they're largely going to lead a revolution against what they perceive as the corruption of the Shah with Western influence. So the leader to know is Ayatollah Khomeini. So he was one of the leading Shia Muslim clerics in Iran, and he was highly critical of the Iran's pro-United States stance, basically claiming Iran is now being controlled by the U.S. and the West. So he is going to lead the revolution. And the revolution is significant. They had well over 20% of the country protesting the downfall of the Shah. Like 20% of a country protesting in a revolution is massive. It was actually much larger in number than actually the French Revolution was from 1789. So, additionally, this was actually kind of surprising. The United States CIA did not really see this revolution coming. It happened fast. So essentially, after they oust the Shah, Ayatollah Khomeini is going to become the supreme leader, effectively a religious dictator of Iran. So they changed the name of Iran to the Islamic Republic of Iran, and they officially create a theocracy. It is like one of these countries in the world we can actually say is a legitimate theocracy, which is a government ruled by religious leaders, and the laws that they're going to create are going to largely be based on Sharia law, which is law from the Quran, the Muslim holy book. So the Ayatollah here is going to basically try and create an Iran that's more fundamentalist. Fundamentalist means you go to the original writings, the original idea of something. In this case, Islamic fundamentalism, literally written in the Quran. Sometimes you hear the word Christian fundamentalism, which will be more literal to the Bible. So the progression of women's rights in Iran are largely going to get overturned in Iran. Although more recently, that's actually now switched back to especially compared to other countries in the Middle East. So additionally, when the revolution's happening, a bunch of U.S. hostages were taken in the U.S. embassy in their capital city of Tehran, which leads to a 3-year-long hostage crisis that eventually those U.S. hostages are released after literally the day that President Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. This is kind of like a shot at Jimmy Carter. But regardless, now Iran becomes an Islamic Republic, legitimate theocracy, and the current supreme leader is called the Ayatollah Khamenei. They do have presidential elections that are largely democratic-ish, although the supreme leader has to approve of all of the candidates who apply to be president, and then they can be voted on as long as the Ayatollah approves. But they still do have a supreme leader. Movie about that called Argo, pretty stinking good. Recommend watching it. All right, so then I don't see too many questions about the Iran-Iraq war. It's just something to kind of know. Iran and Iraq are going to have multiple disputes in the 80s. There's going to be warfare between them. The dictator of Iraq was Saddam Hussein. And this is also where we're going to see the reintroduction of chemical weapons in warfare. Iraq used a lot of chemical weapons against Iran. And it doesn't really, lead to significant change. It's just showing you ideological warfare between the two sides. All right, so Iran, since its revolution, this is something that you hear pop up in the news quite a bit, is Iran has historically been seeking to develop some form of a nuclear technology, whether it be for more peaceful means, like for electricity purposes, or for weapons. So depending on the U.S. president at the time, Barack Obama actually made a negotiation and a deal with Iran that if we lifted sanctions on Iran, that they actually would stop their nuclear technology program, and then Trump abolished that. So probably now in the year 2022 that I'm recording this, they're probably developing a nuclear weapons program. Probably, again, it's all super secretive, so I'm just, doing a bit of extrapolation here. So we generally see this ebb and flow of tension between Iran and the West, especially the United States. The former president here, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, he was very pro developing nuclear weapons. And he has said some very controversial things that's increased tension between the Muslim world and the Western world and Israel. He flat out said that the Holocaust was a quote-unquote myth. He also said Israel should be wiped off the map. And generally saying stuff like that's going to get you into some hot water, especially with obviously Israel, but of course the United States. So Ahmadinejad was then replaced by a bit more of a moderate, and that person also is the person who negotiated with Barack Obama to reduce their nuclear weapons program. Ahmadinejad, I recommend following on Twitter. He has some things to say about American politics. All right, Afghanistan. So we actually covered part of Afghanistan in AP Euro. We talked about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan to prop up the Afghan communist government, which ultimately leads to the Soviet Union leaving Afghanistan, and then that creating a significant power vacuum from 1989 to 1996. So Afghanistan falls into a civil war after the Soviet Union removes its troops in 1989, and that power vacuum was taken up by the Taliban in 1996. From 1996 to 2001, the Taliban instituted an Islamic fundamentalist government. Their legal system was solely based on Sharia law. Women, religious minorities were persecuted. And they also started harboring Al-Qaeda, and those training camps eventually the ones who trained the bombers for 9/11. So after 9/11, the United States invaded Afghanistan to oust Al-Qaeda and also to oust the Taliban, which they do. And then from basically 2001 until 2021, Afghanistan was attempting to establish a form of a democracy supported by the United States, but as pretty much every other country that's ever attempted to invade Afghanistan has figured out, that it is extremely difficult to do that. And the United States officially starts pulling out troops really under the Obama administration, but U.S. President Trump significantly reduced American troop presence, and then Biden removed all of the troops, U.S. troops from Afghanistan. As soon as U.S. troops are gone out of Afghanistan, the Taliban regained control over Afghanistan. So again, as of 2022, Taliban still control Afghanistan. There's some clips from the movie Kite Runner. It was a really good book and movie based upon the Taliban's control over Afghanistan in the 1990s. Highly recommend reading or watching it. It's fantastic. All right, Iraq. So you got to know the dictator is Saddam Hussein. And Saddam Hussein is going to be in power from the 70s all the way till the year 2003. So he's one of those long-reigning dictators of the 20th and early 21st century. So overall, Saddam Hussein's control of Iraq, yeah, it was stable, I guess, politically speaking, but it did have many examples of persecution of religious minorities, and especially ethnic minorities. In particular, the northern part of Iraq, there is an ethnic minority called the Kurds, and Saddam Hussein bombed them with chemical weapons, killing hundreds of thousands of people. And eventually, that's actually what's going to be what Saddam Hussein will be declared guilty of with crimes against humanity after he's captured. He's also in charge during the Iran-Iraq War. All right, so 1990, Iraq, Saddam Hussein, considered Kuwait to be historically part of Iraq. He's like going all the way back to the river civilizations of the Tigris, Euphrates, Mesopotamia. And he invaded Kuwait. And in particular, he wanted control of Kuwait's significant oil reserves. So the United States, not a huge fan of this. Number one, the United States wants to make sure that Kuwait is independent because Kuwait has historically been pretty pro drilling oil, therefore America's going to like that. And also, the United States did argue that they were preserving Kuwaiti sovereignty. Regardless, the United States forms like a coalition of countries. The United States, Great Britain, Saudi Arabia, and they push from Saudi Arabia into Kuwait and push Iraq's military out of Kuwait. They do not invade Iraq. So Operation Desert Storm, which is the American code name for pushing the Iraqi military out of Kuwait, is successful. But they do not invade Iraq. That's going to happen in 2003. So now we get to 2003. So 2 years after 9/11, the U.S. President George W. Bush claimed that Iraq had, quote-unquote, weapons of mass destruction. He never actually really stated what that meant, whether it was chemical weapons, which we know for a fact Iraq had, because they used them against the Kurds, or did that mean he had a potential nuclear weapons program? So, regardless, the United States uses that as its reason for invading Iraq in 2003, and the U.S. and Britain, remember, at that point, Tony Blair is Prime Minister of the U.K., they push Hussein out of power. It took them a few years to find Hussein, but they do eventually capture him. And the Iraqi government, which was a new government created by the United States, form of a democracy, puts him on trial for crimes against humanity, and he is executed by hanging. So, post-Hussein Iraq, Iraq is still trying to establish a stable democracy. They have to contend with the significant ethnic and religious groups of Shia and Sunni Muslims. Iraq has a little bit more of a split between Shia and Sunni, and also the Kurds in northern Iraq. And all those ethnic and religious differences could lead to civil war, although you could easily say, after 2003, there was effectively a form of a civil war going on with the insurgency. So that's one of those countries that I'm always kind of paying attention in the news to see the development of their democracy. All right, so just some other things to note that occasionally pop up on the Regents exam. Arab Spring is pretty important. We'll get that in a sec. Desertification, the increasing size of desert lands. That's kind of a thing in the Middle East. We know that. Yeah, that's more or less it. Arab Spring, gotta know, I would start that one. So 2010, big year. So there was a series of protests for a combination of democracy, for at least ousting authoritarian leaders, starting in the winter of 2010. No, it did not start in the spring. They kind of used the word Arab Spring, similar to Prague Spring of 1968. And in multiple countries in North Africa, there's now movements for revolution. So let's just look at a list here. Tunisia, they drive out the president they weren't a huge fan of. Egypt is probably the most important of the Arab Spring demonstrations. They remove Hosni Mubarak. He's then replaced, and then that guy gets replaced eventually as well. Libya, they capture and then kill their long-standing dictator, Muammar Gaddafi. Syria as well has movements for more democracy, but they are brutally crushed by the President Bashar al-Assad. So Arab Spring doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be successful. Many were not, but there is a significant increase in calls for more democratic governments in the Arab world. And then generally for the Regents exam, the questions they ask about it are often based on the role of technology in spreading the movement. So this revolution was pretty much, or series of revolutions, is kind of like based on social media. So like videotapes from smartphones being posted on Facebook and Twitter, then being supported by people in the Western world, in Europe, the United States. So knowing that influence of technology is key for the Arab Spring. All right, folks, and that is it in 44-ish minutes. Thanks for listening. We have one more section left. I'll see you later.